So welcome. I'm so glad to see you here on this beauteous day. Welcome, welcome on this 5th anniversary of our community. I'm so glad to see you here. And on the 15th anniversary also, as Tina pointed out, of the attacks of 9/11. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later. What I want to do is I want to start our series today on service, on reaching out. And I want to start with a quote from Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who wrote, "I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I do know. The only ones among you who will be truly happy are those who have sought and found how to serve." So today we're going to begin our discussion of reaching out, on being of service, on the joy that comes to us when we do that. So my goal today is just to begin this discussion. This is one of the series at the end we're going to have a discussion on how each of us serves, what we contribute, what we get. You know, at the end of some series, we have a little discussion, and we're going to do it for this one, because I want your wisdom on what you find changes for you when you reach out and serve others. Because we grow internally, and we also fundamentally change our world when we reach out and we are kind, or we love, or we help. So as I was preparing this talk, I went back to one of my favorite books, which is Essential Spirituality by Dr. Roger Walsh. Many of us are familiar with this book, and if you're not, I urge you to track it down and read it. I have a copy, I of course didn't bring it with me, but it's called Essential Spirituality by Dr. Roger Walsh. His book is a result of 23 years of research in and practice of the world's spiritual disciplines. Now his background is kind of interesting. His background wouldn't lead you to think that that's where he would end up. He trained as a psychiatrist. He also had additional training in psychology, physiology, and neuroscience. He published articles and books on the brain. He says he basically worshipped at the altar of science. He was an agnostic. He thought that nothing existed if it could not be quantified, measured, replicated, or validated. God just didn't matter. It was all there, that right in front of us in science. Whatever could not be measured with the instruments of science simply did not exist. So here he was. He pursues his research on the brain, and then what happened is, unfortunately, reality catches up with all of us. He started actually working with patients. Isn't this great? It's like when you have kids. You have all these great theories of childbearing until you have one, and then all the parents are laughing. Okay, so he started actually working with patients, and everything he started to think totally went south. He writes that he had patients who had weird behaviors and weird mental states that he could just not figure out, regardless of all his training and his degrees and his certainty that he knew it all. It just was not working. So in order to learn more about the workings of the human mind, he did a very brave thing. He went into psychotherapy himself, and because that's what he was working on with his patients. And so he thought, well, I'm just going to have a few weeks, a little introspection, a little chatting with Dr. Jones over here, and it will be fun, and I'll understand the problem. Okay, so do you see where I'm going with this? Yeah. It did not work out. As he explored his own mind, he writes, "I discovered an unsuspecting universe within me as vast and mysterious as the external universe around me. It was literally the greatest shock of my life," to this guy. He found that his inner world was the secret to discovering more about himself, the vistas of his consciousness that were totally unreachable and totally unknowable if he had limited his inquiry to his cognitive mind, to what he could measure and know and replicate. It just wasn't enough. When he started to look inside, he realized that was the case. His inner world, as he called it, was the key to understanding his mind, and on a more profound level, himself. So he began to try to connect with his own inner world. So what did he do? He started to meditate. We know that. He started to meditate. He came to realize that his mind, his consciousness, was really way vaster than he ever had thought. But he still was troubled. Why? Because this is primitive stuff. People who sit around and meditate are subject to primitive religions. He was still an agnostic. The last thing he was going to do was tell his fellow scientists that he was sitting around meditating. That's just embarrassing, because that's not what men and women of science do. He was concerned that he was following what he thought was essentially a religious practice, what he called a relic of primitive thinking. We're a bunch of very happy primitives here.
Right.
Yeah. So he spent months puzzling over this question. He just couldn't figure it out. Then one day, he writes, as he was literally walking into the bathroom, he had a complete aha moment. Haven't you all had those? All of a sudden, it's just a God job working in your mind. All of a sudden, wham! He just had an insight given to him. It changed his life forever. He recognized, and he writes, at their spiritual center, the great religions contain a common core of practices to train the mind. A common core of practices for training the mind. He realized that these practices are designed to help us cultivate wisdom and love to lead us into a broader connection with the source of joy, the source of energy, which is within us, the vast universe within us that is totally unknown if we limit our awareness to what we can think. If we don't make the journey from here to here, which I've said before is known as the longest journey you can take. The great religions contain, all of them, contain the secret to making that connection. So what did he do? He plunged into a study, 23 years, of the world's major faith traditions to identify the spiritual practices that give us these insights. You've got to admire the courage of this man. I mean, here he is, a psychiatrist. He says, forget it. I discovered something far more meaningful, and that's what I'm going to do. He went to Tibet. He meditated. He hung out with Buddhists. I mean, he did not do this in a half-hearted fashion. Trust me. So, in his book, Essential Spirituality, he identifies 7 what he calls perennial practices that are common to the world's major faith tradition. And he tells us that following these practices will lead us to cultivate kindness, love, joy, peace, vision, wisdom, and generosity. In sharing these insights, his goal was to tell us that life can be, and the word he uses is ecstatic. Isn't that great? Don't we all want our lives to be ecstatic? I do. He tells us that if we continue to follow these practices, that is where we will get. The growing spiritual awareness leads us into greater joy, enlightenment, wisdom, and peace. We connect with the profound joy that is at the center of all of us. Because that's the point. What is it the Dalai Lama says? The goal of life is happiness. And it's not going out and buying the latest car, or in my case, getting the latest Surface, which parenthetically does make me happy. But that's not it. It is that profound joy which comes from being at peace. That is the goal. And it's not even a selfish thing. Because when we reach that level of just sheer selfless joy, it radiates out. It cannot help but improve our world. Just like in that reading that Debbie read. Our task is to drop into the ocean of human consciousness the most helpful gifts of wisdom, awareness, and love. Let's add joy that we can. Our little gifts will ripple out through the great ocean of human consciousness forever. They are boundless in their effects. It starts with us, but it doesn't end with us. One of the 7 perennial practices is, as he calls it, expressing spirit in action, embracing generosity and the joy of service. That's a great way to look at it, the joy of service. And when I say generosity, I'm not only talking about money, I'm talking about time, talent, your skills, your time, opening your heart to those around you, to the world around you, which is so in need of wide open, loving hearts, to drop those little bits of positive energy into the vast ocean of human consciousness. Now, when we think about giving and about service, sometimes we don't connect these practices with joy. What do we think of? We think of obligation. We think of duty. We think of getting up and doing something we don't want to do because we got to help other people. I don't know. You know, it's sometimes we don't have a sense of joy that goes with it. However, truly selfless service with no thought of return is a profoundly joyful thing for us and for the recipients of that service. Dr. Walsh used the example of Mother Teresa's Sisters of Charity, I think they're called Sisters of Charity, who live in the poorest slums in India and tend the forgotten and the abandoned in those slums. They work long hours, they live in the simplest and most poor circumstances. They face disease and death every day as they go around caring for the forgotten, the abandoned, and the neglected. So one day, a television interviewer goes out to interview Mother Teresa, and he notices that all these folks are smiling. all her sisters are smiling. And so he goes to Mother Teresa and he says, why are these people so happy? Look around. He said, is this a put-on? And she said, no, it's not. She said, nothing makes you happier than when you really reach out in mercy to someone who is badly hurt. The interviewer wrote, I have never experienced so sharp a sense of joy in those circumstances. So we know from our own experience here at One World that acts of love and service don't need to be huge. They don't need to be on the news. They don't need to be global game changers. Just simple acts of service and kindness can transform us, the recipients, and our greater world. Gifts of kindness or caring, not requested, not reimbursed, and maybe not even recognized, because the joy is in the giving, without any thought of return. So why do these instances produce such joy? I believe it's because when we serve with no thought of return, with no thought of getting back, if we do it with the thought of getting it back, it's not a gift, it's a business transaction, right? When we serve with no thought of getting anything back, what we are doing is we are just channeling the divine within us. We are love in action, because that's what we're here to be. We're here to be love and kindness and compassion, and it feeds us as well. When we do that, we are truly being who we are. Mother Teresa said, love cannot remain by itself. It has no meaning. Love has to be put into action, and that action is service. You know, it's funny, my wife is, she is one of the most loving people that you would ever meet, and she's not a very warm and fuzzy person. I know she's not going to watch this, so I feel safe in sharing. She's really just not. But if you are sick, she will make you food. If you need some place to stay, she will offer you a place to stay. She is the most giving and caring person I know. Because for her, love is an act. It is an act of will. It is putting feet to what you believe. That is what Mother Teresa was saying. Love doesn't mean anything if you sit around and just say, I love you. It's nice, but when it really, the rubber hits the road, is when you stand up and you do it. In his book, How Can I Help?, Ram Dass writes that it is our nature simply to step in and help with no thought of reward. Think about 9/11. Think about the day 15 years ago. Think about the energy that went out after that horrible, horrible series of events. Remember, the world was just one for a period of time. Everybody stepped up and helped. Do you remember that energy then? And then, maybe it didn't last. Maybe some of it lasted. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But that is in our nature. And on a smaller level, when we see somebody crossing the street struggling with a package, we go help them. An elderly person is having difficulty walking, we help them. Somebody in a restaurant or a store is sick, we stop and we help. We don't think we're going to get money for it. That's just what we do. Because when we step outside our own concerns, our own preoccupations, our own heads, when we look up and see that there is a person in need, we feel that there is a deeper process at work. In service to each other, as Ram Dass writes, we experience our unity. What a wonderful feeling that is. Just sheer giving. In the Upanishads, it is said, if you want to be happy, be giving. How simple is that? If you want to be happy, be giving. However, in our lives, our lives are complex. We have so many barriers to giving. We have so many ways to talk ourselves out of being generous, of providing service, of sharing the abundance that has just been showered on us. It's mine. If I give it away, I'll have less, right? That's something we sometimes just is a knee-jerk reaction. Sometimes giving of our money, our time, our effort, our hearts feels more like a burden than a joy. Sometimes it's our perception of limitation or our perception of lack. If I give it away, I won't have any. I won't have as much. It'll hurt me. That's not the way the universe works. We know it's cycling energy. If we give it away, it comes back. And that's true in terms of money, love, effort, whatever. That's the way it works. Sometimes we think, I'm just one small person. What can I do? We talk ourselves out of helping, thinking there are so many global issues. The world is such a mess. What can one small person do? Or we look at people in want or in poverty and we think, well, they're just not deserving. We read this a lot. We think they're just not deserving of our help. Why would I give any money to that guy? He looks like he can get a job. He looks like he can work. He'll probably just drink it away or buy drugs with it. Why am I giving him anything? Why should I pay for all these people on welfare who don't want to work? Why should I give my money or my time to them? Does this sound familiar? I mean, we hear this all the time. I never give money to people on the street. God knows what they'll do with it. We're not asked to figure out what they're going to do with it. Our job is to give it. The universe will take care of the rest. You know, and it's funny, these are attitudes that we develop as we supposedly grow in age and grow in wisdom. Now, what do we teach our kids? Do we teach our kids not to share? Do we teach our kids not to be kind? No. We teach our kids the way we know we are supposed to live. We teach them to share. We teach them to love each other. We teach them to be forgiving. We teach them to give. Why do we teach these wonderful values to our kids and then we leave them at home when we go out the door? I think we should listen to what our kids teach us. We should listen to ourselves. We should listen to what our kids say back to us. Let me tell you a short story. My wife had some business friends in town a couple weeks ago, and one of them came out to dinner, and a couple days later, she got very sick and had to have an emergency appendectomy. And she was someplace out west, but here she is by herself in some hospital, I guess downtown, having an emergency appendectomy. When she got out of the hospital, Deborah, my wife, asked her if she would stay with us for a few days till she was ready to travel. Because you can't go from surgery onto a plane. You just can't do that. Okay, so you may know that I have a son, Nick, who has Down syndrome, who lives with us. And if you know Nick, he is a wonderfully warm and loving young man. So Deborah was explaining to him that this lady was going to come stay with us for a few days. So he thought about it for a minute. He goes, "Is she ours now?" Is she ours now? And so Deborah said, "Well, honey, she's not ours now. She's going to be ours for a few days, just while we take care of her." And he thought about it again. He gave a huge smile, and he said, "We take care of her good." We take care of her good. Just like, wow. You know, just without even thinking, just stepping into what he knew was the right reaction, how we knew that he knew we all should live. Our kids know this. We teach them. We need to listen when they teach us back. It's in acts of service that we remember that it's our job to take care of each other good. As our reading said, each act we do changes our global consciousness, adding to that vast pool. I love that image. A vast ocean of universal consciousness. And there's negativity in it, there's fear, there's lack. But every time we do something wonderful, every time we reach out, a drop of love, of joy, of wisdom, of caring goes in. And we see what happens when we drop stones into ponds. It ripples. It goes out. It grows. And that is the same thing that happens. That's how our global consciousness changes. Turns away from fear and greed and violence toward hope, compassion, and community. The change begins with each one of us just putting the energy of love out in whatever ways our small hands can. It's like, look at the front of your program. What does it say? It doesn't, you may think that each act is insignificant that you do, but it's not. It's not. We have to keep doing it. Each act also works a change in us. When you open your heart and you give to another, what happens? Your heart opens first. The first recipient of the gift of joy is going to be you, because you cannot give away what you do not have. Acts of selfless love and giving start with selfless love and giving. Your own heart grows. That's why Walsh identified it as a perennial spiritual practice, because giving leads us toward awakening and enlightenment and wisdom and peace and joy. So it's particularly fitting that we're beginning the service today on the 15th anniversary of the attacks of September 11th, 2001. Like many days of absolute extreme tragedy, it was a day of extremes. Extreme pain, suffering, fear, death, but also extreme sacrifice, heroism, caring, and service. So as I was reading the paper yesterday, I came across an article in the Washington Post about the tiny little town of Gander, Newfoundland. Did any of you see that article? Okay, they saw that article. It was a town of no more than 10,000 people in Newfoundland. As the news of those attacks spread, the airspace over the continental United States was closed. Okay, so how many planes were up there? Let's just say lots. So many were diverted to Newfoundland. This little town of 10,000 people got 53 commercial international flights landing at that airstrip. They processed and housed and fed over 10,500 passengers, all of them stranded, speaking different languages, terrified about what was going on, trying to contact loved ones. This town just opened their heart for who they called just the plain people. P-L-A-N-E. School gyms, libraries, meeting halls, all were opened and used to care for these plain people, these temporary refugees. The sick were cared for, everybody was fed and housed, the elderly were put in private homes, there were folks who were pregnant, they were given doctor's appointments. I read that all the high school students were required to volunteer. Any volunteers? Yeah, the hospitality shown to these guests was absolutely extraordinary. Their needs were met. It's not just that they were housed, they were welcomed. They were comforted, they were cared for. An article read, "The people of Gander, a town of no more than 10,000, looked at all those planes lined up at the airport, and they didn't think of terrorism, they didn't think of potential attacks, they just wanted to help." An extraordinary thing. The love that was given to them, by them, to these passengers was returned and continues to grow. One of the articles talked about a lady who was on Delta Flight 15, and she had been housed in a neighboring town of Lewisport, because there were so many people, they were kind of sent around to little towns around there. And Delta Flight 15 was housed at a little town called Lewisport. As they left, they asked the townspeople if they would take money. Nobody would. They were out, who knows how much money, they would not take money. So one of the passengers decided to set up a scholarship fund. She polled her fellow passengers. By the time they got back to, I think, Atlanta, they had $15,000. And this lady started a scholarship fund for the kids of Lewisport, Newfoundland. She passed around a notebook, she got everybody's names, she got contributions, and of that $15,000, that fund, called the Lewisport Area Flight 15 Scholarship, has grown to about $2 million. Seriously. The scholarship has been received by 228 graduates of Lewisport Collegiate High School. One of the graduates is now the town doctor. So think about that. You never know where it's going to go when you reach out, when you serve, when you just extend yourself. From $15,000 to $2 million, and it's still educating people. There are 28 scholarships this year. So out of the worst possible circumstances can grow acts of love, of mercy, of sacrifice, of kindness that continue to ripple in that vast global pool of human consciousness. So today is also the 5th anniversary of our community. And you can look around and you can see the people around you who reach out, who help, who may not even be recognized. I don't know what each of you do, but I know you all do something. And I know you all create those ripples in this pool. Whether you do Meals on Wheels, whether you do Children's Restoration Network, whether you visit the sick. We know here at One World that acts of service change our world. They change us, they change our world. So I'd like to end with a quote I think we all know from that Bengali writer, musician, and poet Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote, "I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and saw that life was service. I acted, and behold, service was joy." That's how it works. So let's take these thoughts into the next.